Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Nietzsche 213 on Georges Bataille. At the very same moment that Martin Heidegger began lecturing on Nietzsche at the University of Freiburg in the winter of 1936-1937, Georges Bataille and a handful of his closest intellectual collaborators, including the artist André Masson and the philosophers Jean Val and Pierre Klosowski, among others, published the second volume of their new review, Acéphale, Religion, Sociologie, Philosophie. The date of publication, January 1937. The title, Nietzsche et les fascistes, une réparation, a reparation, a repair, illustrated by André Masson's drawings of these headless and groinless figures of man, or rather not groinless, but rather castrated and skulled figures of man. Acéphale, as you know, of course, means headless. This headless man, according to Bataille, would point us both to the surhumain, the superhuman, and to the death of God. L'acéphale, the headless man, Bataille would write in his essay Proposition in 1937, is the mythic representation of, quote, the superhuman that is fully death of God. The volume is dedicated to recuperating Nietzsche from the fascists. The lead article, Nietzsche et les fascistes, is a violent diatribe against Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche, somewhat curiously renamed Elizabeth Judas Forster, as well as thinkers who, according to Bataille, had distorted and abused Nietzsche's word, including George Lukács on the left, but mostly Alfred Rosenberg, Alfred Baumler, and other contemporary fascist thinkers who had misappropriated Nietzsche's work, pilfered quotations out of context, and betrayed his thought. But of course, they did more than just take Nietzsche back from the hands of the fascists. They also produced a certain Nietzsche, one they hoped would be more resistant to future appropriations and misappropriations. On their view, Nietzsche's thought could not be put to use. In capital letters, they would write, La doctrine de Nietzsche ne peut pas être asservie. It cannot be made to serve. It cannot be used. Nietzsche s'adressait à des esprits libres. Nietzsche addressed himself to free spirits, incapable of letting himself be used. Through this Acéphale journal and other collective projects, such as the Collège de Sociologie from 1937 to 1939, and later the Revue Critique, Bataille and his collective built a bulwark to keep God dead and to entrench a certain agonistic reading of Nietzsche. Most of Bataille's collective projects, Acéphale, the Collège, the Critique, can be interpreted in light of both this yearning for solidarity, one that perhaps was shared, oddly, by Nietzsche, a yearning for solidarity tied with a deep loneliness, a struggle against, and a fear of madness. According to Bataille's personal journals during the war, Nietzsche was his lifeline. Reading Nietzsche kept Bataille sane, or insane, as Bataille would ambiguously suggest, and prodded him painfully, anxiously, to experience life at its fullest, to the limit. With few exceptions, Bataille wrote in 1944, in the text that we'll be talking about today as well, Sur Nietzsche, my company on earth is Nietzsche. Nietzsche seul s'est rendu solitaire de moi, disons-nous. Nietzsche alone made himself one with me, or rather, let's say, with us. Now, Bataille wrote on Nietzsche during the war predominantly, he tells us, between February and August of 1944, the end of the war, with the intent of publishing it on the 100th birthday of Nietzsche on October 15, 1944. He would include it in what he would call La Somme Athéologique, a play on words, of course, on Aquinas' Summa Theologica, one intended in large part, again, to entrench the death of God, as if we had to do it over and over again. Aphoristic in nature, like Nietzsche's writings, Bataille's writings on Nietzsche would read like a deep personal quest, practically a life or death struggle and a constant limit experience. As Foucault would note, la somme théologique a fait entrer la pensée dans le jeu risqué de la limite, de l'extrême, du sommet, du transgressif. It is precisely this work that would lead Foucault to experience philosophy as experience, in contrast to traditional philosophical discourse and debates, which in Foucault's view had become no more than doing the history of philosophy. With Bataille, with Nietzsche, with Bataille on Nietzsche, as well as Blanchot and Klosowski, Foucault would approach philosophy as experimentation on the self, as limit experiences, as ways to tear oneself from oneself in order to become someone new and to produce new work. In reading the latter parts of the work from the summer through August 1944, which are essentially his diaries and journals written during the end of the war from his home, one feels in the country, in Vidler, I think, one feels that indeed throughout the wartime period, throughout the bombardments, the air raids, the firefights of others, Bataille's only intellectual companion is Nietzsche, and with the exception of K, a lover, it is practically only Nietzsche that is his only other human contact, though Proust, Blake, and a few others appear here and there. Now, Bataille presents his relationship with Nietzsche as an impossible one, a struggle, a defeat, a recurring emotional battle to experience Nietzsche's thought. But even for Bataille, who claims at times to be the only one who had not completely misunderstood Nietzsche, even Bataille ends up in a state of disarray, of désarroi. I attempted to draw from myself the consequences of a lucid doctrine, one that attracted me as light does, but I only reaped anguish and the impression of most often succumbing. What then does Bataille draw on philosophically from Nietzsche? That's what we're here to discuss today. By contrast to Heidegger, who you will recall from last seminar had focused so heavily on the will to power and the eternal recurrence, and later on nihilism after the war, Bataille was at first drawn to Nietzsche's writings on the death of God, which makes a lot of sense in relation to his own biography. But beyond that, I would see in his writings on Nietzsche a deeper engagement with the notion of evil, of le mal, and with the struggle that consumed him, and in which I feel he did not feel successful to get beyond evil. In fact, one could go so far as to say that Bataille wanted to recuperate Nietzsche on evil from the Nietzsche of the will to power. But we will see. We will see, and I'm sure we'll have various interpretations. To help us read Bataille on Nietzsche this evening, we're fortunate to have with us one of the world's, if not the world's, leading expert on Georges Bataille's writings. And I don't say this lightly. We are fortunate to have the scholar who has edited the official French editions of Bataille's complete works at Gallimard, who has prefaced the Pléiade edition of Bataille's novels and writings, who has written perhaps more extensively than anyone else on Bataille's work. Denis Hollier, who joins us from New York University. And notably, for purposes of this conversation as well, in his exchanges with Anthony Vidler, Denis Hollier is also the author of La prise de la Concorde, des essais sur Georges Bataille, translated as Against Architecture. Professor Hollier will be followed by our own brilliant Rosalind Morris, anthropologist and critical theorist here at Columbia University, who Jesus and I know and knew would shed the most perspicuous critical reading on Bataille's interventions from the Collège de Sociologie and the Acéphale Review over the full arc of Bataille's work and oeuvre. And having read her intervention, which is on the website, and so I know that you've had an opportunity to already start in on this work, it's masterful, and of course I am both unsurprised but delighted that we are in for a real tour de force. Then Professor Rosalind Morris will be followed by the brilliant Dean Anthony Vidler, who I actually had the great pleasure and honor to work with more than 33 years ago when he directed the program on European Cultural Studies at Princeton University. And since then, he's been chair of the Department of Art History at UCLA, Dean of the Irwin and S. Channon School of Architecture of the Cooper Union, and is now teaching both at the Cooper Union and at Yale University. So I can't think of a better panel to help us read Bataille. My dearest colleague and friend, our philologist, medieval historian. Remember that Bataille's thesis was a 12th century L'Ordre de Chevalerie. So we have a medievalist with us, and at the same time, a contemporary critical thinker. I couldn't think of anyone who could top that. So Professor Jesus Velasco will intervene and moderate the discussion. Denis? And we're trying to shoot for about 20 minutes.
Don't worry.
Total?
Per
intervention.
Yeah, I mean, I won't take that much time. I was just going to trying to find the place here, and I'm sorry for being so late, that the Labyrinth is a very important theme in Bataille. I didn't realize that the geography of Colombia was so complex. Okay, so I'll make some kind of more or less improvised remarks. Tragedy, expenditure, sacrifice, laughter. Nietzsche is everywhere in Bataille, even when he's not named or not quoted, even though he probably is, together with Proust, the most quoted of his, let's say, library. And he shares with Proust the focus, most of the quotations that Bataille takes from Proust or Nietzsche are linked to the experience of time, to the experience of time as destroying being, as an time as an erosion of the stability of being. And the last section of that book, we probably will talk about it a little more, sur Nietzsche, which was written, as you just said, during kind of very important, strangely important historical period, which, since it was essentially debarkation, D-Day, but it's true that Bataille was in his little province, quasi-village, Vézelay, seeing from time to time American or British airplanes bombing the surrounding. So that last section of the core of Sur Nietzsche, the title is Time, and Bataille, in particular, makes some articulations between Zarathustra and À la recherche du temps perdu. And he talks about those moments where being itself has become time. We are in a kind of beginning of existentialist context where the articulation of or the disarticulation of time and being is a very important point. And the first references to my recollection that Bataille makes to Nietzsche, which are in that same issue of Acéphale, the Reparation à Nietzsche, the key figure that also articulates, the reflection on time and Nietzsche is Heraclitus, and I will quote, a quotation of Nietzsche. Nietzsche wrote, in the posthumous book, the Origin of Philosophy, where there is a chapter on Heraclitus. And part of that chapter is quoted in Acéphale, and so I translated, the small introduction that Bataille wrote for that text by Nietzsche about Heraclitus. So Heraclitus, as I said, Bataille, who, according to Nietzsche, opened the curtain on the grandest of all spectacles, the free play of destructive time, which is time as or time and destruction. So in Bataille's references, Nietzsche is maybe not the most important, probably the most personal. I'll just mention briefly the other name, which are always present in his reflection. There is psychoanalysis, himself having been through analysis and having read Freud, and in particular the Freud, the Freud which was translated in French in 1927, which is Beyond the Pleasure Principle, the Freud's reflection less about sexuality than about the death instinct. He also had in his library a very small, probably, but important anthropological reference to Marcel Mauss and his essay on gift, un essai sur le don, and essai sur le sacrifice également. Another very important name in his library, and which is always put in dialogue or in conflict with Nietzsche, it is Hegel, to whom he was essentially introduced by the famous seminars of Alexandre Kojève at l'École des Hautes Études. And there is also the discovery, at the time where every, let's say, avant-garde writer discovered that's when Sade was published, and Sade has been also a major reference for Bataille. So, Acéphale. So I would comment a little bit on the title that Bataille gave to the second issue of that journal, which in French is Réparation à Nietzsche. And this afternoon I was wondering, in fact, what does that mean exactly, reparation? Did Nietzsche need some repair? Well, no. I think there is a resonance which I didn't realize before, which is the theme of the war reparation. How do you call that? The
compensation.
Yeah.
Reparations.
Reparations. Yeah. I think, yeah. Indemnities. It was called indemnities in English, which was so between France and Germany during the 30s, there was a big issue which was, part of the general European landscape, which was that Germany was supposed to pay for all the war damage incurred to the Allies, because Germany had started the war. And I am sure, so the word réparation certainly resonates with that in the context of Franco-German relationship. And the article that Bernard just mentioned is, in fact, devoted somehow to German reparations to Nietzsche. How Germany hurt and damaged, how the Nazi, and how, in particular, Nietzsche's sister, by organizing that Nietzsche cult, damaged, and there was some reparation to Nietzsche owed against the whole German tradition of reading and interpreting Nietzsche. So then that Franco-German, the German as historical and political, presence is of course extremely essential in the very idea of the 1944 book Sur Nietzsche, which is the more or less, maybe I don't want to dwell on that, but Bataille was really not, he was totally unknown. He hadn't published except in avant-garde journals. The first book that Bataille published was published in 1943, L'expérience intérieure, the inner experience. Then he wrote a kind of a follow-up called Guilty, Le Coupable, and he started to write Sur Nietzsche even before Le Coupable was published, and so he started in early 1944, which is a moment where, everybody knew that the Germans were going to be defeated. Everybody knew that something was, at a world historical level, being underway, which was going to lead to the defeat of Hitler, and Bataille was kind of fascinated, he kind of, staged the publication of a book on Nietzsche, which should be, which should happen at the same time as the anniversary of his 100th, the 100th of his birth, but also it should appear at the time of the defeat of Hitler. And in fact, the French book, when they are launched, there is a little in bond, how you call it, a little wrapping, with an inscription. And what the book was published with that inscription, the defeat of Germany is the victory of Nietzsche. So, but in spite of that kind of contextual opportunism, the book was, of course, a total flop. And the book, in fact, was never reprinted during the lifetime of Bataille. The only time it was reprinted was when it was included in the complete works 30 years later. And I would like precisely to think about the absence of reaction that that book provoked. The way that, of course, historically other things were happening so much more important. Who would care about that strange book, which I'll describe it briefly as Bernard already did. The core of the book is a diary written between February 44 and July 44. That includes D-Day. And the diary mixes somehow two themes. There are two lines. One is the beginning of a love story, of an affair, which was more than an affair, since it is the future second wife of Bataille, Diane K. So that's one line, and it is a relationship which is starting and which puts him in a lot of anxieties of not knowing, what's going to happen of it. And parallel to that, there is what he witnesses, which is essentially the France under the bombings of the Americans who are in the process of defeating the German. So that's a very strange, Sur Nietzsche is a very strange title if one thinks about the content of the book. So why wasn't it received? That's a little bit what I would like to think about. Well, first of all, Bataille was not an academic. And I think when I see the list, the fascinating list of names, of this seminar, in fact, all of them essentially are academics, with few exceptions: Blanchot, Klosowski, and so not only Bataille was not an academic, but he was not a scholar either. He was, and I think that Nietzsche in France there was no scholarship about Nietzsche. Nietzsche was a writer for, like, I won't talk about it, but later in his life, but I will go back to Nietzsche. It didn't be, in fact, it has been translated in Zone, by Zone Books, in the second volume of the La Part Maudite. A whole reflection about Nietzsche, Gide, and Thomas Mann. And so what I want to say is that the reception, the Nietzsche studies in France were essentially literary. And the big name, the big scholar who wrote a 4-volume study of Nietzsche, his name is Charles Handler, was teaching German literature at the Collège de France. He was not at all a philosopher. He was a specialist of pan-Germanism. How intellectual Germans, or German intellectuals, have always dreamt of a greater Germany, a Germany which would be limited by any borders. And that in that context, that Charles Handler, wrote a 4-volume, very documented book about Nietzsche as an exemplar of exemplary, pan-Germanist thinker. So Nietzsche, I don't think that there was ever a course, a class, or a seminar on Nietzsche in any university in France in a philosophical context. The philosophical context was dominated by post-Kantist philosophers, or by Bergson, who himself was, very anti-German. But what's interesting is that when, let's say, the big period of canonization of Bataille after his death in the 60s, when the complete works were published, so there were, in particular, 2 major articles by young philosophers at the time. One was by Foucault, called Préface à la Transgression, and the other one by Derrida, which is called from restricted dépenses to the general. What's very interesting, those are 2 major philosophical recognition of Bataille, and in none of them the association with Nietzsche is mentioned. So even, and Derrida, Foucault in particular, will be talking about Nietzsche start to talk about Nietzsche at the very same time, but there is no associations between Bataille and Nietzsche. Okay. Not to mention the fact that a third name of that same generation, which is Deleuze, and Deleuze publishes a book whose title, that is second book, which is a statement, which is Nietzsche philosophe. To state Nietzsche philosopher to state that Nietzsche is a philosopher was, in fact, a kind of almost groundbreaking statement. It meant, yes, Nietzsche was not a poet. Yes, Nietzsche was not for people like Gide. Nietzsche is a philosopher. But Deleuze, of course, doesn't mention Bataille, but it is not simply a silence, it is a condemnation. I mean, Deleuze does not have any interest for whatever Bataille said about Nietzsche. Okay. So I'll just conclude very briefly by giving kind of mise en abîme of the relationship between Nietzsche and Bataille. And maybe, I thought about that, maybe we should think, in fact, about the implications for us, the theoretical implications of the concept of reparations and reparation à Nietzsche. And there is, reparation is a main concept of Melanie Klein. Bataille never read Melanie Klein, and I don't know if Melanie Klein was, when she started to speak about reparation. But in Bataille's relationship to Nietzsche, there is something of a desire for a reparation. What motivated Bataille to write sur Nietzsche is the idea that nobody ever listened to Nietzsche. That, what has to be repaired is the fact that Nietzsche hasn't been heard, that the voice of Nietzsche has never been received. It is a message which remains en souffrance. And Bataille, you quoted some of those sentences of sur Nietzsche. Bataille wants to receive, to create the position of Nietzsche's addressee, finally. And of course, the mise en abîme is the fact that the way Nietzsche was not listened to, was not heard, led Bataille to write a book which nobody noticed. Yeah. Well.
Thank you. That's quite an irony, isn't it?
Thank you, Bernard, and thank you, Jesus. Can you hear me? Good. I want to start by saying it's nice to be back, but both Bernard and Jesus know that I resisted very powerfully this generous invitation, feeling in advance, I suppose that I would be in the position, I mean, this is scandalous to say, but the position that was ventriloquized by Babette Babiche last time when she quoted Heidegger on Nietzsche. Nietzsche hat mich kaputt gemacht. And I am in that position with Bataille, and also enormously humbled to be, between these two much more knowing thinkers on the matter than am I. So I will try for a moment, in a very un-Bataillean way, to repress what I have learned from Denis and Anthony, which is most of what I know, actually, about the relationship between Bataille and Nietzsche. And my response to that was to try and go back to the text in the only way that I know how. It's hard to question Bataille, having been established as the critic of liberal utilitarian thought, of rationalism and acquisitive individualism, of violent unity and transcendentalism, having assumed the mantle of Nietzsche without ever having committed parricide, Bataille resists criticism. Indeed, criticism of Bataille risks appearing in advance as a defense of these inadequate philosophical positions, and this is underlined and made even more complex by the fact that Bataille himself says in advance that criticism of him will be difficult. I don't land anywhere, he writes. This is why criticism of my thought is difficult. Whatever might be said, my reply is given in advance. My reply is given in advance, and for me, significant criticism will only be a new means to anguish with intoxication remaining the starting point. Bataille avows incoherence, or rather the, and I quote, the certainty of incoherence in reading. But I think we were given and encouraged to think by virtue of the, in fact, by virtue also of the conversations last year, we were given texts that staged something of the opposite. And I think we've been motivated in this seminar to think of these writers, these thinkers, their texts, in terms of a political utility for our contemporaneity. And this is, I think, the very thing that Bataille's textual practice and indeed ambition is to resist. Nonetheless, the text we have suggests something else. And I quote, war, this is from Propositions, which was one of the texts we read this week, war to the extent that it is, we can maybe slide along to the text there if you want, but in any case, war to the extent that it is the desire to ensure the permanence of a nation, the nation that is sovereignty, and the demand for inalterability, the authority of divine right and of God himself, represents the desperate obstinacy of man opposing the exuberant power of time and finding security in an immobile and almost somnolent erection. National and military life are present in the world to try to deny death by reducing it to a component of glory without dread. Now, as you know, if Bataille is going to have an erection, he's going to feel it and know that he's feeling it. Defending Nietzsche against the charge of an incipient tendency toward National Socialism, this is the medium, this is the object of the Reparation, Bataille writes that Nietzsche dreamed of a humanness which, embracing its tragic fate, would raise itself above social slavishness. This Übermenschheit would be defined by its willing of the future, but also, and this was discussed last time, its willing of the past. And willing the future, it would recognize, and I quote again, the known to be surpassed. Bataille glosses this willing as a recognition that our native country is what belongs to the past in us. And I agree. Although there are conservative versions like Renan that make exactly the same point. And like Bataille, I'm frightened by those who find it easy to reduce political activity to propaganda cliches. Again, those are his words. But this does not take us very far. And in fact, Bataille's pre-war anti-fascist writings often, it seems to me, approach their own reduction to cliché. Such reduction thwarts reading, but it also exposes certain contradictions inherent in Bataille's position. The war itself, the subject, the scene, the mise en scène of the text that we read, sur Nietzsche, the war itself seemed to demand a more complex formulation than the willing of the future or the past. After all, total war is the milieu of chance, of its extreme dramatization in tragic mode. As such, it demands a willing beyond past and future. Chance, therefore, becomes the object of willing for Bataille. Of course, he is also not the inventor of that. You think only of Mallarmé's coup de dé, in which we have those wonderful lines, the roll of the dice does not cancel chance. But in this context, one is left with the question of how to separate the willing of... You can't hear. Oh, I'm supposed to be using that. You know, this is. I can only do one thing at a time. In this context, in Bataille's context, in 1944, one is left with the question of how to separate the willing of chance from the willing of war. Can you hear me better that? Yeah. In 1944, amid the sound of artillery, as Denis has just described, Bataille writes of the war as a transcendence against immanence. And he concludes that if the essence of fascism is national transcendence, it can't become universal. It draws its particular force from particularity. Still, he is seduced at the end of that text by the undeniable immanence of the liberating American soldiers, how much more beautiful they seem to him, existing in themselves, than the transcendent mediocrity of the Germans who fail to arouse him. When a disgusting and ridiculous mob forms in the aftermath of the liberation to purge the collaborators, Bataille is repulsed most of all by a petite middle-class woman who appears to him as likely mean-spirited and narrow-minded. And it's this encounter with this woman so devoid of sexual allure who incites in him the contemptuous outbursts against propaganda, not the Hitlerites. The Hitlerites are in the background, but the occasion of the outburst is the encounter with the woman. It is her grotesque voicing of the Marseillaise that leads him to concede that the hatreds, hopes, hypocrisies, stupidities accompanying the great movements of weaponry obliterate him. Sexually repelled, he can remark the indifference of the cosmos to such activity. What unfamiliar reality pursues its end or pursues no end at all through such noise? But that's because the war is over. As Denis Hollier remarks, the philosopher who made virility so central to philosophizing and who had linked war to the festival as well as the orgy produced a rapturous description of Paris and the rest of France during its bombardment by American forces. The muting of the guns, by contrast, left Bataille hollowed out, lacerated by empty desire. Now, certainly the end of war, any war, except perhaps drone war, I'm not sure. The end of war, any war, must bring a relaxation that borders on destitution. And a war can appear in retrospect as that which gives life its intensity. But we may yet ask what past is willed in the vacated state to which the war delivers Bataille. With all those bodies falling beneath bombs falling, the willing of that which falls, like the randomness of dice as they fall, writes Bataille, is itself a risk. Nietzsche, recall, worried that people take refuge in life to flee chance. To avoid the lies and superficiality of such avoided life, he proposed the mask in place of deity. Bataille, for all his adoration of tragedy, seems, I think, a little more devoted to what is, rather than what appears. Or rather, because of his adoration of tragedy and the transformation of willing that he believed it demanded, Bataille performed an inversion in the idea, or an overturning of the idea of eternal return. Return, he says, is the mode of drama, the mask of human entirety. It unmotivates the moment and frees life of ends. In this way, via a shadow play, a kind of shadow play in which the real is the nocturnally projected effect of an illusion, willing chance becomes a means of willing the past, but also the future. Now, on the one hand, Bataille's interpretation of what it might mean to will the past activates a critical dimension of Nietzsche's thought, especially as it's inscribed in Untimely Meditations. A critical dimension working against nationalisms. And this would be the very essence of the Reparation, to find in Nietzsche a critique of nationalism. On the other hand, it can risk making willing seem sufficient as a solution to the problem. A problem, frankly, that is as present to us now as it was to Bataille in 1944. That problem concerns the additional force, the lure and the charge of nationalism and every totalizing identity formation, precisely in the moment of its being experienced as past lost. It's the hyphen here that I'm inserting, the past as lost, not as loss, as lost. This attraction does not merely afflict the exiled, whose expulsion or dislocation often has as its internal corollary the sensation of being torn from an origin. It adheres to anything that is amenable to being lost. The future anterior is also a mode of past lostness to come. And it is thus the stuff of anxiety rather than anguish, angoisse, in Bataille's sense. And it suffuses nationalism's panics and exclusionary purges with an ardor indistinguishable from what arises with any other fetishism. I have Trump on the horizon. There is in this context, though, a somewhat urgent task, namely learning how to separate pastness from loss, in the sense of being lost, without introducing the specter of a residual presence, and thus restoring the metaphysics inseparable from transcendentalism. This task, which entails the aesthetic education of the unconscious as much as the training of the intelligence, is leaped over by Bataille. Beyond the opposition between loss and gain and between the reversal that would merely identify them, i.e. say loss is gain, and that's exactly what Bataille wants to resist, he will signify loss by conjoining it with risk, while nonetheless insisting that risk is not speculation insofar as the latter anticipates gain, and no logic of probabilities can be allowed to contaminate this understanding of risk in his mind. Chance is thus resignified. It is time, it is rivalry, it is brazenness, it is the subjection of oneself to possibility and to the knowledge that one cannot know in advance the outcomes of one's actions. Or, if one can know in advance some of the outcomes, that is limited to the limited point of view from which an individual human being calculates. There's always residual Kantianism, there's always an exterior point of view that will decenter the subject and undo the means-ends calculation. For Bataille, this is the anti-humanism, I think that, Denis, you have so correctly insisted on in Bataille, despite the fact that he's always writing about the human. It is not the centering structure of any epistemological project. For Bataille, even the most careful, calculated economism is, from a more general perspective, a throw of the dice. Gambling, this needs only to be avowed, the dice thrown. Now, the references to gambling in English translate the repeated gesture in French. Well, it's ridiculous that I here on this panel am saying this, but would be more literally translated, although their colloquialism is accurate, would be more literally translated as putting into play. Mise en jeu. The will to chance is a putting into play of everything and especially of oneself, but it is less the bondsman or the slave of Hegel's dialectic than the child who models this risk for Bataille. Bataille observes Nietzsche's interest in children and in child's play. Children's putative innocence and forgetfulness is contrasted to the melancholic attachment to the past that infuses nationalism. They don't remember anything from day to day. What interests Bataille, you can be grateful, Jesus. What interests Bataille in this context is Nietzsche's concept of play as an occurrence that exceeds the given. Yet if he links this incalculable surplus to the sacred yes, as he calls it, he also acknowledges that Nietzsche's play might obscure the truth as much as the word love. Indeed, at times in Sur Nietzsche, child's play signifies triviality and worse, the very opposite of that gambling or gaming, that putting into play which Bataille equates with human possibility. Thus he writes that if God was what they say, he would be chance. But, being everything, he cannot be chance, which would entail endless risk. God cannot risk himself. He cannot, being everything, he is immune to loss, or more properly, beyond loss. Accordingly, Bataille concludes that compared to the urgencies of God, compared to the urgencies of a chance, thank you, God's necessities are child's play. This is where Bataille's anti-humanist anthropology begins and I think ends, with an identification between the human and the capacity to will loss, to will chance to play. In Anthropology from a Pragmatic Point of View, Kant addressed the possibility that humans are played by their representations as much as they play them. This is the Kant that people forget, I think. Kant also made recourse to children and play and invoked their imaginations, running riot in the night after listening to terrible fairy tales, in his theorizing of a more reasoned and reasoning aesthetic autonomy. Bataille answers that philosophy with a concept of sovereignty that requires and stages the breaching of isolation, not in mutual reciprocity, but in communicative loss. Humans are singular in their capacity to will this loss, but it is willable only by leaving behind the perspective of individual human interests. And here, loss has as its kind of figure detumescence. At first, I think it seems that Bataille's chance would seem to be the other, and indeed the opposite of economy, or at first sight, the domain of accounting, prediction, valuation, exchange of equivalents. That kind of economy, that liberal economy, is driven by the aspiration to accumulation and structured by a calculative principle that links means and ends while reducing judgment to the quantitative assessment of value as an efficient and maximizing relation between the former means and the latter ends. And it's not that Bataille disavows this existence or the significance of this kind of economism. But alongside that, he says, there is production and consumption. But consumption, he says, needs to be understood as having two distinct parts. The first reducible part is represented by the use of the minimum necessary for the conservation of life and the continuation of individuals' productive activity. The second part is represented by so-called unproductive expenditures, dépenses, luxury, mourning, war, cults of sumptuary monuments, games, spectacles, arts, perverse sexual activity, those deflected from genital finality. All these represent activities which, at least in primitive circumstances, had no end beyond themselves. So note that in 1933, the time of this text writing, before Bataille would take up the Reparation, Nietzsche, before he would take up the defense of Nietzsche against the accusation of an implicit complicity with National Socialism, war is still straightforwardly included in the category of expenditure. Via the principle of apposition, it's placed in a relation of homology with all the modes of expenditure, from art to perverse sexuality. It has not yet been the subject, or has not yet been subject to a differentiation according to which bad war, the war waged in the name of nationalism, has been ejected, and yes, returned to what will later appear as the more naively humanist opposition between good and evil. Bataille universalizes the function of expenditure on the basis, of course, of a well-known anthropological comparativism that he draws from Marcel Mauss, whence he derived the theory of the potlatch. And in the written version of this text, I've given you a citation from the earlier text that Mauss co-authored with Henri Hubert on sacrifice, which has a kind of both a far more incandescent rhetoric and a far more radical understanding of sacrifice than that which appears in the Essai sur le don, which was itself part of a double act of mourning. It appeared in a sequence of the journal, the first part of which was simply a multiplicity of obituaries for all the other anthropologists who died in World War I. So the gift is the second act of mourning, the reparation, perhaps, that accompanies this other act of mourning. I'm not going to go all anthropology on you, I promise. But what's important to grasp about the argument about the potlatch, because it is so frequently misunderstood, is that the potlatch was on a continuum of total social institutions under the name of gift, different from the others, which were understood to be more obviously what forms of circulatory exchange, only by the degree of violence of the antagonisms associated with them and the intensity of the exaggeration accompanying them in Moses' analysis. He's referring to institutions that became visible to the anthropologist only in a very distorted moment of settler colonialism at a time of extreme distortion of those economies. But he says it's like all those other institutions, but more intense. But what marks it as both typical and different is that it retains the institution, the force, the logic of sacrifice, which the gift elsewhere had displaced. Sacrifice as a principle of communication in destruction. That was the question of the sacrifice. Why would you give a gift to anything, and certainly not the gods, which would be destroyed in the process of giving? And it's this dimension of the sacrifice that's so important in Bataille's perhaps dilettantish reading of the anthropological archive, a reading that was nonetheless enormously important. Enormously important for him, enormously important for everything that would be later done in the name of Bataille. Bataille actually reinvested the alterity of these so-called archaic societies in order that they reveal what usually escapes our perception, and what it shows, he says, is our basic ambiguity. Raging against the idea that value is a function of scarcity, he claims that there is always production in excess. This is why the sun can function as a figure. Strange thing, the sun, totally inanimate thing, non-organic thing, can function as a figure for the human. That is to say, it gives without receiving. He writes, energy which constitutes wealth must ultimately be spent lavishly. So we move from the figure to a kind of normative engine inside this statement, with the word must marking that point. The ambiguity of which Bataille writes is one in which people both recognize the truth of life in the negation of the servile use of possessions, while simultaneously making a service use of this negation. Okay, I'm going to stop very, very soon, I promise. Many people have criticized Bataille's rather Weberian representation of his own economic milieu as one lacking expenditure, in which, bourgeois selfishness has interrupted all the procedures of expenditure. These criticisms range from Luxemburgian analysis of militarism as expenditure to just straightforward critiques of what goes on in bourgeois life. Others have ridiculed the endorsement of foreign aid as a mechanism for redistributing wealth in an unequal world. I mean, that's the model, The U.S. must give foreign aid to India to repair inequality. But Bataille's admission that criticism of my thought is difficult, and whatever might be said, my reply is given in advance, also refracts a cosmic principle. The global movement of energy is for him unaltered and unalterable by the decisions individuals make, whether to will chance or not. He quotes Nietzsche's gay science, momentary tragedy aids the eternal comedy of existence, and the sea with its countless smiles will cover the greatest of tragedies with its waves. It's not clear to me that we can afford this position. It's also not clear to me that Bataille actually accedes to it in the end. There is, if not in Sur Nietzsche, then in the accursed share, the hope for a more suitable exudation, as he says, and there is always the hope of communicating with a lover. Communication meaning here the continuity of that loss into another person. Indeed, such communications, or the desire for them, traverse the text of Sur Nietzsche with relentless, if irregular, frequency. It seems impossible for Bataille to speak of war and not also to speak of communicating with his lover, for both the biographical reasons and for philosophical ones. It seems impossible for Bataille to speak of war and not also to speak of communicating with his lover and Nietzsche. And Nietzsche is there in the bedroom, as it were, as dancing spirit, as ghostly voyeur, as third party. Bataille claims to be the only one of Nietzsche's readers to pay him due respect, but in an inversion that is characteristic of Nietzsche's, of Bataille's work, this respect also takes the form of a betrayal. Nietzsche, correct in his ambition to go beyond good and evil, nonetheless erred in adducing the concept of the will to power to do so, says Bataille. I am opposed to all forms of coercion, he writes, but this doesn't keep me from seeing evil as an object of moral explanation. And he continues, as a means to triumph over significant difficulties and over the opposition between individual and collective or good and evil, only the audacity that comes from taking chances will freely prevail. Chance is a way of going beyond, and Bataille offers the will to chance as a more appropriate, as a properly corresponding concept for Nietzsche's intentions, which he suggests were diverted into and by the will to power. I will save you my somewhat irritated concluding remarks, but I will ask us to think of why it is that that subtitle, Volonté de chance, was not part of the English title. It's not, still Nietzsche is missing Volonté de chance. It's in the book, but it's not in the title. I'll stop there.
Well, and Bernard, thank you for inviting me here, and thank you for being a great student. Now, I confess that this talk is about my own studentship. Can I do the first slide? I was walking down 59th Street in the sun this morning and across, and had a wonderful reverie about rocks and Central Park and backlighting, and I've been interested in photography recently and so on. And then suddenly I was brought up short by a black and white sign which said Trump Realty. So I actually went into the lobby of Trump Realty, and there is the exhibition of all the great, perhaps the greatest buildings in the world that have been built by the Trump organization. And it occurred to me that Trump or one of his aides should certainly read Bataille on the skyscraper.
We're ready to go.
Okay, so I just do that. Now, where's my... No? It's the right one. Yeah. So this is my studentship, which started in 1974 with the publication of Prise de la Concorde, when this book, which was much later translated, as we shall see, about Against Architecture, hit the Paris stands in the rentrée, and for a number of different reasons, which I can't go into today, excited a very large group of architects. Many of them had been involved in the 68 disturbances, and I will try and make some sense of why it was they were excited and why I was excited. In 1974, Denis Hollier published what he called an essay on Georges Bataille. Probably should be called Reparation à Georges Bataille, entitled La Prise de la Concorde. The title will become clear. He begins, as he said, at the beginning, but not with Bataille, on whose early publications he had edited on the invitation of Michel Foucault, but with Hegel, and seemingly even more, quote-unquote, forced, as he admitted, with Hegel not as a philosopher of knowledge or history, but of architecture, arche. We begin, Hollier wrote, with architecture. The first place, said Hegel, belongs by the very nature of things to architecture. There follows one of the best concise explications of Hegel's theory of architecture in three parts: simple beginning, the Hegelian edifice, the Tower of Babel, and the symbol. This beginning of an essay on Bataille is not, notes Hollier, in order to develop any aesthetic system like Hegel's, nor to advance any theory of architecture. The task, he stated, is above all only to sketch, dessiner, a structure, to follow and put in play a gap, a fissure, that shakes up, ébranle, monuments, which of course, as we shall see, is precisely what Bataille himself wished to accomplish throughout his life, to provoke an earthquake, to literally unsettle or unseat, to rattle or to shock monuments, ébranler les monuments. Now, as Hollier himself admits, Bataille shows no evidence of having read Hegel's aesthetics, nor having wished to write a theory of architecture. If he had intimated an anti-Hegelian stance in his study of the Lassault cave paintings, La Naissance de l'Art, but to begin his essay on Bataille with architecture was simply an initial beginning strategy, perhaps simply metaphoric, as he later explored, to treat of one who in his first published article had himself begun with architecture with an essay entitled Notre-Dame de Reims, probably written around 1918. There are many interesting aspects of this article I can't go into tonight, including its anticipation of Le Corbusier's own meditation on modernity and tradition, Quand les cathédrales étaient blanches, with Bataille's evocation of Reims Cathedral in the time of Jeanne d'Arc, all young and white. But I will here only emphasize his long meditation on the destruction of this symbol of motherhood, of characterization we should remember, parallel to that of Jeanne d'Arc sent to the prison and to the pyre, au bûcher, by the German bombing. As Hollier parses, and I oversimplify his parsing, the prose of this vision, Bataille sees the mother, the cathedral, ruined by the father, the war, and will heretofore attempt to reclaim the pinnacle of the edifice through vision, that of the pinnacle, the pineal eye. But this is only the beginning. 10 years later, Bataille will, as we shall see, employ the architectural metaphor to even greater effect, but with the same refrain, that of the ruin of the monument. I began with Hegel, but I might as well have begun with Nietzsche, as the demi-subject of our discussion this evening. Not that Bataille had, to our knowledge, read much of Nietzsche, or rather the excerpts I'm about to read. In fact, I'm talking mainly about Bataille before Nietzsche, and I'm sure he assimilated Nietzsche through Kojève and Hegel through Kojève, but I'm not sure that he had read necessarily in great detail the lectures on aesthetics. But even as with Hegel, so with Nietzsche, the meditation on the monument retains its umbilical connection to Bataille's own. First, from it's supposed to be the right one, no?
You got it.
Oh, okay. First, from human all to human. A stone is more a stone than before. In general, we no longer understand architecture, at least we do not do so nearly as well as we understand music. We've grown out of the symbolism of lines and figures, just as we have weaned ourselves from the sound effects of rhetoric and no longer imbibe this kind of cultural mother's milk from the first moment of our lives. And I won't read the rest of the quote. You can see that. And second, from Daybreak. The Hellenic is very foreign to us. I want to concentrate on the last stanza of that aphorism. How simple the people of Greece appeared in their own conception of themselves, how greatly we surpass them in our knowledge of man, but how labyrinthine do our souls appear to us in comparison with theirs. If we desired and dared an architecture corresponding to the nature of our soul, we're too cowardly for it. Our model would have to be the labyrinth. So there is a death of rhetoric, the death of the mother's rhetoric of mother's milk of meaning, and we're encased and involved in the labyrinth. And finally, the architect represents neither a Dionysian nor an Apollonian state. Here is the great act of will, the will that moves mountains. The intoxication of great will belongs for art. The most powerful people have always inspired architects, and one could reverse that. The most architects have always been inspired by the idea of power. Nietzsche's initial formulation, stone is more stone than before, laid the loss of a once pervasive meaning in architecture, originally a kind of cultural mother's milk, at the door of beauty. Meaning formerly tied to dread, the uncanny, and the exalted, terrifying sublime, was seen as dissipated in the face of an all-encroaching beauty that in turn was constructed as artificial and cosmetic, a thing of the boudoir rather than the principle of life, mindless, womanlike, and more interestingly, mask-like. The first premises of this argument were, as the evocation of Unheimlich Erhaben suggests, rooted in late Romantic thought, and especially that of Schelling, who had uttered a similar cry of loss over the death of the uncanny at the hands of the Homeric sublime. In Nietzsche's uncanny sublime pairing, the mysteries in their sequel are brought together in what seems to be an aesthetic extension of the interplay between Dionysian and Apollonian principles developed in The Birth of Tragedy. Here, unsurprisingly, given our beginning in his discussion of disappearance of the symbolic form of art, Nietzsche is echoing Hegel, who in his lectures on aesthetics spoke of the moment when the symbol, dedicated to the perfect unity of inner meaning, the eternal shape, was undermined by the classical will to use and dominate according to a strict separation of means and ends. His example was that of didactic poetry, where the content is entirely developed in its prosaic form to the extent that any artistic shape imposed on this form is external and ornamental. What has become prosaic in itself is not to be reshaped poetically. It can only be dressed up, just as in horticulture, for example, is for the most part just an external arrangement of a site already given by nature and not in itself beautiful, or as architecture by ornament and external decoration makes pleasant the utility of premises devoted to prosaic circumstances and affairs. The most recent evocation of that, of course, is Robert Venturi's distinction between the duck and the decorated shed, the monument and the barn, which has a decoration on it to make it look like what you want it to be. In these terms, Hegel maintained didactic poetry and by direct implication architecture, itself tied to the symbolic in its fundamental nature, cannot be numbered amongst the proper forms of art. We presented them with an art, architecture, the first of all arts, symbolic in its essence, that essentially cannot remain symbolic, having to become prosaic before it becomes architecture, and therefore doomed to an ornamental condition. Or in reverse, we are faced with a notion of ornament that in the moment it's indistinguishable as ornament, detached from the essential symbol, inevitably undermines the symbolic equation of form and content, fatally marking architecture for an unhappy death long before all the other arts. And any of us who've ever taught studio for the number of years that I've taught studio will always remember the exhortation to students to make form and content relate to each other organically. The implication of Nietzsche's labyrinth metaphor, on the other hand, for his philosophical thought has been well explored, but as applied to architecture, and in this case to the appropriate architecture for the modern soul, the image gains in significance. For as Hubert Damisch has observed, the force of the labyrinth as a model from antiquity to the present is that it is a space with no outside. Its meaning resides solely in its interiority. It has no arch, it has no cover, it has no arche, it has no head, right? Covered over, subterranean, invisible, it only manifests itself to a subject who has already entered its maze-like passages. Moreover, if the subject is not to lose his way, he must, like Odysseus, follow a thread that is less seen than felt. With no facades to identify its presence and represent its significance, and with blind occupants, the labyrinth is the prototype of a non-visual monument, experienced haptically, as Alois Riegel would understand it, rather than optically. Let's now return from Nietzsche and Hegel to Bataille. And so to that essay from the Critical Dictionary and Documents, Architecture, Architecture, the discussion of which takes up the main central chapters in Hollier's book. I cannot summarize and could not with justice summarize the chapter here, but simply present it to you as a kind of follow-up, so to speak, of the Hegel-Nietzsche complex we've just construed. Architecture is the expression of the very soul of societies. As human physiognomy is the expression of individual souls, it is, however, particular to the physiognomies of officials, prelates, magistrates, admirals, that this comparison pertains. In fact, it's only the ideal soul of society, that which has the authority to command and prohibit, that is expressed in architectural composition. And the word composition here is very important to remember, properly speaking. Thus, great monuments are erected like dikes, that opposing the logic and majesty of authority against all disturbing. It is in the form of cathedral or palace that church or state speaks to the multitude and imposes silence upon them. It is in fact obvious that monuments inspire social prudence are often real fear. The taking of the Bastille, and of course the prise de la Concorde is a phrase that echoes the taking of the Bastille, the prise de la Bastille, is symbolic of this state of things. It's hard to explain this crowd movement other than by the animosity of the people against the monuments that are their real masters. In his identification of the monument with power, of the monument with human physiognomy, and with the increasing evolution of the architectural monument toward geometrical abstraction, Bataille takes up all the tropes of late 19th century loss of symbolism discourse, together with a Nietzschean sense of embedded and embodied power in architecture. To attack architecture is to attack man in his essence. To see modern society in its raw state is to understand architecture, and vice versa. The architectural chain gang that constructed the pyramids, the cathedrals, and the modern prison is the social chain gang constructed by architecture. But Bataille goes further in his relentless deconstruction of architecture. In his brief view of the photographic album X Marks the Spot, in Chicago, the Spot Publishing Company of 1930, published in Document in 1930, Georges Bataille remarked on the custom of publishing photos of criminal cadavers, qui semble également se faire jour en Europe, représente certainement une transformation morale considérable touchant l'attitude du public à l'égard de la mort violente. To illustrate the point, Bataille selected a photograph from this first photographic history of Chicago gangland slayings, the one on the top right, depicting a corpse of an assassinated gangster found in the the ice of Lake Michigan, the figure face up, as if frozen while floating, a literal monument to its own death. In one sense, of course, this image has no relation to the concept of X marks the spot, announced in the title of the album, and referring to the custom of marking the position of the victim after removal of the body. There is in this case no mark to be left on the ice following the excavation of the frozen corpse, and its place of discovery was destined to be effaced forever with the subsequent thaw. For an instant then, the corpse acted as its own X, one only to be rendered permanent in the police photo. And this photograph, as Didi Huberman has recently pointed out, was itself an enigmatic record. One sees first not very much, insofar as the image evokes a pure and simple place, chaotic place, a magma, a white, black and white magma. And then one recognizes the man sunk in the ice, probably assassinated, taken by the ices of Lake Michigan. Transformed into an anamorphic vision by virtue of the flattening surface of the ice and the angle of the photo, the dead gangster has been doubly recomposed, first as a marker of the site of his own death, secondly as a visually encoded hieroglyphic image of that mark. Further, whatever place was marked by the position of the body was not the site of the assassination itself, but rather the place where the gangster had ended up, propelled by the currents of the lake and frozen by chance on rising to the surface. A mark, therefore, of the ever-exilic, ever-transitory place of death in modern urban life, but at the same time of the consistent popular fascination with the nature and signs of that place. This signal of Bataille's interest on the position and role of X in marking the spot of death in the city anticipated by 8 years his more developed reflection on Nietzsche's proclamation of the death of God in an essay on which the role of the mark is now played by a monument. Oh, this is, I'm sorry, I have to go to the Obelisk of Luxor, erected in the Place de la Concorde in 1836. And the spot is that of the erection of the guillotine for the execution of Louis XVI. In this process of transformation, in which a police inquiry into a murdered gangster is enlarged to encompass the death of God, the mystery, who was the victim and who the murderer, is similarly deepened both by the historical age and mysterious origins of X in Europe, in Egypt, and by its subsequent deracination and transposition to modern Paris. The circumstances of its reutilization, Reparation de l'Obelisk, and the subsequent history of its interpretation and reception in the Place or Place de la Concorde, when joined to the monumental history of the Place itself, established for Bataille the appropriate mise en scène in which to stage the cry of Nietzsche's madman, with lantern lit in broad daylight, "I'm looking for God." Hence, of course, the title of Hollier's study, a phrase that recalled the more common prise de la Bastille. Bataille's own investigation into this supposed murder, however, is also set in the context of his inquiry into architectural monumentality and the space of the public realm in modern culture. I'm going to leave a little bit here. Bataille, drawing on a century-and-a-half tradition of obelisk interpretation, the apparently immutability of its pointed presence afforded a point of reference for meditation on the shifting foundations of modern philosophy. For modernist architects, in contrast, the obelisk was purely absent. In comparison to the sphere, the cube, and the pyramid, whose symbolic life has been sustained throughout the modern period, the obelisk seems hardly present. Indeed, what was for... I'm reading very... I'll post the whole thing. When you asked me to do this, I just started writing, right? I couldn't stop. The obelisk as a substitute for a statue was appropriate. According to Hegel, the obelisk should be classified. According to Hegel, the obelisk should be classified among those monuments that stand somewhere between architecture, properly speaking, and anthropomorphic sculpture. So the obelisk is, in fact, a subject. Together with menmons and sphinxes, the obelisk was, Hegel argued, a kind of transitional object, neither architecture nor sculpture, but rather the one tending toward the other. Its tapering form, its pyramidal tip, gave it the semblance of a body with a torso and a head. For Hegel, the role of the obelisk was in this way fundamentally different from that of the pyramid. The pyramid was symbolic in its outer form, participated in the symbolic nature of traditional independent architecture, was at the same time inhabited, even by a mummified and deified royal corpse. It thus signified the inevitable fate of symbolic architecture, which could never remain symbolic to remain architecture, that of becoming useful as a tomb, being valued for what it contains rather than for itself. Of that is, developing into the classical stage. By contrast, the obelisk was purely symbolic in its outer form and possessed no inner cavities for inhabitation. It took on the form of that which it symbolized, the sun's rays, in a purely abstract manner, owing nothing to nature or the overt imitation of the human figure. But precisely through this symbolization and its analogies to the figure of raw power, the obelisk bypassed the architectural state altogether, tending toward the sculptural. Hence, the epigraph with which Bataille began his investigation of the obelisk takes on its force. I can't. Yeah, okay. Life never ceases to gravitate around these stones which had, until then, until now, maintained the state of agitation and anxiety in society. Beyond the obvious imitation of spaceless, placeless, post-urban condition of the present, Bataille's observation of anxiety turning around these standing stones returns, when set in the context of his reading of Nietzsche in the 1930s, to his inquiry into architectural monumentality in Documents, and more particularly to his article Espace, Question de Convenance, and its attendant illustrations. And it's not going to work. Here Bataille begins to explore that profound destabilization of the realm of the monumental operated by the force of space itself, one, of course, which was completely conversant with the modern movement's eradication of monumentality by transparency and horizontal espace infini or espace total of Le Corbusier and his friends. Here Bataille begins to explore the profound destabilization of the realm of the monumental operated by the force of space itself, and more precisely the psychological power of space considered as a fluid, boundary-effacing force, always a displaced and displacing medium, unable to be defined by philosophers, uncontrollable and voyou, beyond the bounds of surrealism's wisdom. He said, it's incongruous to assert that the space might become one fish swallowing another. It's above all represented by its slippage and subsistences, its susceptibility to earthquakes. Obviously, it will never enter anybody's head to lock the professors up in prison to teach them what space is, the day, for example, the wall collapses in front of the bars of their dungeons. A clue to Bataille's meaning may be gleaned from his first qualification of the word espace as convenance, proprietary or suitability. In architectural theory, since the Renaissance, and especially in the 18th century, this was a loaded term, referring to the classical codes of appropriateness of a genre or an architectural order to a particular monumental program, at its simplest regulating the application of the orders and constraining decoration to a rigid social hierarchy. But evidently the convenances of which Bataille speaks are very different from those of the classical canon, or rather even as they rely on former canons, they're conceived in order to establish entirely new mixed genres and canons, not a social hierarchy, but of its dissolution, not a social proprietary, but its withering away, new genres and canons, that is, of power and eroticism represented in space, precisely through the abilities of space itself to dissolve boundaries. Nietzsche was read and often quoted by Le Corbusier, who was ever seeking the triumph of a modern subject that would overcome tradition and its fear of universal infinite space. But here Nietzsche was closer to Bataille, or Bataille to Nietzsche, Dionysian or Apollonian. For Nietzsche, space always represented the agonizing vertigo of potential annihilation, of falling into, as Heidegger would repeat, but without too much hope in finding solid ground beneath. The public square, or at least the modern public square, was for Nietzsche the very expression of modernity's lack of truth, the stage for the manifestation of every mask-like false identity. The space of the public realm, then, was never so empty as when fully populated, as, for example, in Zarathustra's characterization of the flies in the marketplace. Nietzsche was unambiguous from the beginning. I walk through the new streets of our cities, and I imagine that in a century nothing will remain of those hideous houses built by the generation of those who think publicly, and then by the opinion of those house builders will also have crumbled. Again, ruins, destruction, and the end of monumental architecture. The translation of Denis Hollier's book, La Prise de la Concorde, first published in 1974 and reissued by MIT Press under the title Against Architecture, raises a number of questions for contemporary architectural theory. It did then, and it still does now. I still give it to my students, and they are entirely entranced by it, and at the same time, slightly depressed, both by its presentation of Georges Bataille's architectural writings, as well as by its own 15 years of influence on architectural circles, initially in Europe and now in the United States. This influence is signaled immediately by a dramatic change in the title of the English edition. A work initially dedicated to the study of the early writings of Bataille was now directly pointed towards an architectural rather than a literary readership, and further with the full expectation that a work ostensibly attacking the very idea of architecture might find favor in architectural circles. There's nothing like the masochism of an architect. This analysis of an architectural method in Bataille was written, Hollier notes, in the first flush of enthusiasm that followed his foray into the papers left by Bataille after his death in '62. Issued under the imprint of October Books, a series organized by the editor October and published by MIT Press, the book has been redirected, so to speak, by means of a graphic image of the burning Cathedral of Reims in 1914 towards an audience of architecture that's been recaptured by the decades of French critical theory. That, like Hollier's own book, has been increasingly republished in translation with endless time lags of 10 to 15 and sometimes to 50 years. In the wake of the events of '68, which seemed themselves to offer the potential for the practice of alternative politics, and were conducted by students whose reading of Bataille's La Part Maudite informed their critique of orthodox Marxism and communism, the way was already clear for the reading of Bataille in different disciplinary contexts. Foucault's writing on transgression in the early 60s, often dedicated to other members of Bataille's Collège de Sociologie from the 30s, culminating in his presentation of the first volume of Bataille's complete works. This widely circulated writings of the Situationists, led by Guy Bedvor, had before this stressed the post-war continuity with a contestatory practice of surrealism and its offshoots, including Bataille. Architects, finally, were ready for a discussion of the profession as what Foucault was to characterize as a panoptical discourse. Architecture is the disciplinary apparatus par excellence, the discourse for all other ordering disciplines, a universalization through modern urban planning of the prison. Against this sensibility, the notions of the motions of disorder, the random, the not included, the displaced, the diverted, and all importantly, the subversive practices of eroticism and their spillover into the public realm of spontaneous festivals and carnivalesque play were adopted as the slogans of an architecture that might owe as much to the pleasure principle as it did to the death drive. Two architects in particular adopted these principles very early on, Bernard Tschumi and Rem Koolhaas. I don't have time to display the effects of Bataille on Tschumi or the effects of Bataille on Koolhaas, but take it from me, Bataille is deeply present in the erotic destabilization of the monument by Tschumi and the underpinning of irony and anti-monumentalism until quite recently at least of Rem Koolhaas. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Denis, Rosalind, and Tony, and Bernard, for your interventions. I'm going to just going to give the floor to our friends in the room. I had a commentary on the question, but I think I can wait. So perhaps some of you want to ask some questions, make some comments to our guests. Yes.
Actually, thank you all for your presentation. This is a question that it's okay. Okay. I was just wondering how you think about Bataille's, the way in which Bataille is thinking about democracy, because in the pages that we read, he has a lot of comments on democracy, particularly in terms of community and all that. And I was just thinking how that plays out in the themes that you touched upon or perhaps did not touch upon. But for me, that was one of the most kind of intriguing aspects in these particular selections that we had to read. And so if you have something to say on that, I would be interested to hear it.
You mean on the mass?
Democracy.
Democracy. Oh, yeah, okay, yeah. Democracy.
Same thing for some people, right.
Well, I think that, something maybe which hasn't been, we didn't talk much about it, but there is somehow a big break in Bataille's life, which is when, which is a war, which is, in fact, the Munich crisis. And before 1940, Bataille was, as almost all avant-garde, intellectual, was totally opposed to the concept of representative democracy. There was a deep, the root of Bataille's reflection is a criticism of representation. And a kind of, we would say today, there is a kind of note of populism called to direct expression of and so thinking about the first title of my book, La prise de la Concorde, also alludes to a very important moment in French politics, which is the extreme right demonstrations, the pre or proto-fascists in France, on the Place de la Concorde against the parliament, the assemblies just across. So, and I think that what I call la prise de la Concorde is the moment where Bataille started to, first of all, wonder why it was the extreme right who was producing those riots against democracy and not the left, and then towards the reflection where the issue of criticizing representation was no longer that simple. It was no longer the myth of a direct access to power by the masses was no longer sustainable. So, and then the second part of Bataille's work and thought is, as you said, in fact, he's kind of a thinker of liberalism. The arrival of the Americans in 1944, that's the arrival of liberalism. And Bataille, in fact, will think, in economic, social, political terms in a certain line of liberalism. So there is a kind of big gap between the utopia of a direct expression of the masses before the war against, the corruption of the representative system, and after the war, a kind of more, I won't say deconstructionist, but with a more complex strategy between the society and the power.
Can I pick up on this? I think that obviously the relationship between democratic thought and partisanship and parties and the masses is a complicated topic. But I sense that, and so as I was thinking about this, I think that actually there's a way to focus on a piece of the text that actually will bring together kind of reparation, in response to this question, that will bring together reparation and notions of chance and notions of labyrinth. And it's this passage on page 16 of the French. It's in the preface, it's section 5, it's page 24, Roman numerals in the English translation, where he's talking about this le gâte-sauce, the kind of the spoiler, the wet blanket. It's translated as wet blanket, but it's kind of the person who kind of spoils you all the time, spoils things all the time. And he says, and this, of course, is a central passage for Bataille in Nietzsche, because he's really focused on this section. And he says, certainement, je gâte. So this is, in some sense, this is Nietzsche talking. I spoil to everyone the taste that they could have for their party, for their partisanship, for their membership, right? I spoil that for everyone. And that's what no party can ever forgive. So, Gay Science, section 172. Now, and to a certain extent, that is one of the deepest tensions, I think, that Bataille is trying to deal with, which is the fact that he himself had this yearning, a real yearning, I feel, for some form of collegiality, membership, all of these projects, all of these collaborative projects, a real yearning for collaboration, right? But on the other hand, this critical instinct that always undermines it and doesn't make it possible. so that at the end of the day, there can be no membership, even though there's this constant desire for it, which ties into, I think, democratic participation, etc. Now, I think that it ties to the reparation because I think that's how he's trying to correct the way Nietzsche was read. In other words, and it's right in that passage, it's right before that passage that he says, Nietzsche would have been the philosopher of the volonté de puissance. He has been understood as the philosopher of the will to power, and he's supposedly represented himself as such, he supposedly was received as such, but I think rather that he was the philosopher of evil, right, and not the will to power, because what Bataille is associating with the will to power here is forms of partisanship and domination, and political participation through partisan domination, which he wants to resist, etc. And it's where I think it goes to chance ultimately, because I feel that he is defeated in this project. He feels defeated in this project and turns to chance as a default, as kind of nothing left to do but to give it to chance. And it's this passage on the same page. So this is it's important. It's an important section, I think, of the preface, which the preface, of course, was written at the end after, and to a certain extent, the preface ends up being where he does his greatest direct intervention on Nietzsche, I feel, even though he says part 2 is the theoretical part, but I actually feel as if it's ultimately after he's written everything, after he's published the journals, etc., that he's making his greatest intervention. But it seems as if he's falling back to chance, labyrinthian chance, perhaps, as this default. And so it's this passage on the bottom of the French page 16, or on the bottom of 24 of the English, which is not but to translate it, ces contradictions folles. Il m'a semblé qu'un coup de chance seul, it seemed to me that only a chance encounter, right, donné dans l'audace du jeu, given in the audacity of a game, right, could help us extricate ourselves from here somehow. So it seems to me as if that is actually a central struggle in here, but it doesn't lead to. It leads to default in kind of a rolling of the dice, it seems to me.
You've also got this ludicrous project of a secret society, which is the most extreme form of a party form imaginable, with initiation rites. So on the one hand, this kind of absolute disavowal of the logic in which we encountered this very conversation reproduced in Foucault's seminars, that the problem at this point in his moment in history was that avowal was asked only in relationship to the party, not in relationship to whatever kind of ethical projects or other relations and so forth. So you have, on the one hand, this extreme version of that, the most extreme version imaginable, a parody of the party, and on the other hand, this contempt for the petit bourgeoisness of which, every time someone appears in that text who could be classed as petit bourgeois, his bile is just spilling everywhere. But similarly, and you've written about this, the pretense at an identification with the masses, the presumption that one is going to feel an affinity and so forth is constantly belied by, his withdrawal, his strange self-isolation in other ways. But I'm not sure about the chance thing, because it seems to me that, he also says, quote I have in my text, but Nietzsche speaks tirelessly of power while having in mind the capacity to give. And this leads him to say the will to power is the mistake, the gift is indeed the modality, the institutional modality of chance. Why? Because unlike market exchanges, monetized exchanges, it extends in time. And there is, in some fundamental way, a radical indeterminacy about whether it will ever come back, or on what time scale it will come back. And everything that's in that discourse about the gift is already in most. And interestingly, what's not in most is, or what's not in Bataille, is the fact that instead of, it's not a model of a generous society endlessly living in the moment in a kind of spontaneous, sovereign set of relations. It's the opposite. It's a mercilessly lawful order. The reason he wanted the order of the gift brought into Europe is because you wouldn't be able to choose to give. It wouldn't be a kind of the goodwill of the bourgeoisie giving charity, or the welfare state deciding if you deserve it. No, you would have to. It was because it was a law that it was useful. So there's this kind of strange inversion that Bataille performs when he calls from this concept of the gift in relationship to this distancing from Nietzsche, a dimension of the gift that is really bourgeois fantasy. It's kind of pure generosity, spontaneity, the kind of self-willing and so forth. Exactly the opposite in that sense of the Maussian concept of the gift. And I think it's of a piece with this, frankly, not actually very left conception, not very, actually quite anti-democratic. Yeah.
And in relationship to the quotation you gave us about the unproductive expenditures, which are this, which include monuments and various other things that he's seeing in time crumbling and eroding, and seeing a kind of erosion of space. There are cults which he then establishes, right? And then there's a secret, not only a secret society, but an absolute ban on even speaking about it, right? So it's so secret that nobody, in a sense, can ever penetrate it, right? It is the cult, right? It's at the bottom. It is at the bottom of the end of a labyrinth. There is no Ariadne's thread to find your way to, right? And it's right in that windowless enclosure.
At this moment, the Rosicrucians are on the kind of top of the hit list of the Vichy regime.
Right.
And I mean, I was wondering, actually, you would know about this, how that figure of a secret society as the bad object, or the good bad object of Vichy France was being possibly, I don't know. I mean, how does one think that in relationship to this other secret society?
Well, before that, in the moment that Hitler invaded Paris, his first instruction to the general was to go to the Grand Orient, seize the archives, and entomb those archives of the Freemasons in the Bibliothèque Nationale.
Just 1 second, Nadia wanted to intervene.
No. The biography of Bataille entails some bizarre things, and himself talks a lot about that. What he had in mind when he, started the Collège de Sociologie and Acéphale was, in fact, against the concept of party. He wanted to found a religion. He had a kind of fantasy of a cult founder, with no following at all. But he tells that you have that in the apparatus of I forgot which volumes. But you can say, I cannot believe how crazy I was. I wanted to found a religion, a Nietzschean religion. Yeah. So it was specifically against the system of representative democracy in the party. So, yes, it's all that is, and himself, changed totally, self-criticized, but there was that moment in the late 30s where, there is, among Bataille scholars, there is a long, endless discussion. Was he really engage in a kind of fascist model or not, but there is that idea that the democratic representative system had failed, and that one had to create some kind of more identification in the Freudian sense. Yeah. But there's something I'm talking about Mauss. I think there is, in my view, between Mauss and Bataille, and I think you talked very well about that, there is more than the gift. What is at the center of Bataille's obsession is the loss. And that's part of chance. Chance. Nobody can. You don't play without the idea of you are winning. Mm-hmm. So the idea of one cannot face the one. Yeah. So what he's trying to introduce is le principe de la perte, the principle of loss, more than the gift as such. Yeah.
Do you want to pass the mic to Nadia?
Yeah, I like then to go from loss to reparation, because of course there are several ways of interpreting reparation. One is an attempt to erase what destroyed in order to recover the original, which almost is impossible, or it is possible, a condition perhaps that you forget what's happened, and thus you erase memory and you can recover what you've lost, because it's memory that makes you think about the loss. Or there is the other thing, or the other way, which is more justice-oriented. You give something in order for fix or the suffering, fixing the suffering that you provoked. This is a kind of justice approach that I don't think that you would like at all, because it's a way of keeping the loss always there in order to be calculated in the retributive justice operation. Or there is another one, perhaps, and it's simply forgive or forgiving what's happened, and thus you accept the fact that you can have an accumulation of many losses, and thus the reparation is at the end a series of layers of losses, so that you don't have nothing there to protect or to reparate in the original, but you accept the idea that it is a list of losses and thus of something that cannot be reparated, but except in this multiplicity of breaking, delacerations, and so on and so forth. So, but to reach this point, perhaps, you perhaps need to accept the fact that there are losses and not to be so obsessed with the idea of loss.
I'll try.
I think, you're absolutely right. I mean, and that's part of what we all said today. There is in Bataille the feeling that it is not possible to lose. There is always something that remains. Sur Nietzsche, there is no way to leave loss. There is always something that remains. The monuments. There is, and there is in Bataille the fantasy of a real loss which cannot be reached. Somehow, in the logic of Bataille, a loss is never total, and that's what fascinates him in the potlatch, is that you give a gift and it cannot be returned. And what always comes back in Bataille, that always something returns. There is always a ghost. There is no, that's what makes him write. You know, he writes to say he shouldn't write. You know, there is, and in that sense, I think, you know, Derrida's reading of L'Essai sur le don is, in fact, probably more Bataillean than Derrida himself would recognize.
Joseph, Leah, and Andrew.
Okay, I would just like to go back to what we were talking about on the idea of party and so on. It's just like I was reading the psychological structures of fascism, and there he talks about positive, possibly positive subversive elements of society, which could present a form of resistance to fascism. And when I was reading this text, because I was always wondering what these positive subversive elements could be, because he somehow says it's also in opposition towards the idea of something like a revolutionary subject as it has been thought by the Marxists and so on. So I was wondering what you would think about that. Or yeah.
Why don't we take all three questions and then we kind of comment on them. Joseph.
Professor Morris, I'm hoping you can help me think about something a bit more and tease it out. I really appreciated your intervention. I've been thinking a great deal about Bataille and concepts of sacrifice and excess and sexuality, especially in the context of queer theory, because Michael Warner, Tim Dean both have cited Bataille as influences on their work, and Tim Dean's ethnography of barebacking in San Francisco very much operates under, in part, a logic of gift-giving, a logic of excess, a logic of risk, and also a logic of eroticizing the chance of contracting HIV. And so I'm wondering, how do you see Bataille as, or the mode of analysis that Bataille engages in? How can we use that for a critical queer project? In addition to the ways that, that are currently in circulation, Dean's idea of gift-giving or documenting gift-giving, and Warner's idea of subverting the normative. How else do you see Bataille possibly in service of a queer emancipatory project?
Thank you. Andrew? I'm sorry?
We defer to those. Those are really great.
Okay. All right. I'm sorry? I couldn't see. Is there another question? Oh, Rafael. Sorry. All right. Can you speak up?
One of the things that Morris was saying, the doubt of the doubt about Nietzsche, about Bataille really being convincing in his own approach to certain freedom for Nietzsche, and that you were talking about the communication with a lover remains this desire for communication. And I was, one thing that struck me in the passages on Nietzsche, so for example, page 17 of the preface of Hegel, the one which was cited in French, he excuses himself about talking about his private life in the following pages. But then he says, je n'en souffre pas, je ris volontiers de moi-même et ne connais pas de meilleur moyen de me faire pour endormir ma note. So this je ris volontiers de moi-même, so I laugh at myself, is also in the text itself as a condition. If I laugh, or if I'm in a moment of self-derision, then something can work towards this idea of imminence. And that this is a good condition, but I was wondering whether anybody anything to say about that, because in a sense that is also one of the biggest things that's taken from Nietzsche is a certain idea of what
Well, maybe I'll just start with the most direct question, and then others have much to say too. I mean, when I started off a little flippantly by saying, you know, it's difficult to instrumentalize Bataille for not only because he gives you this kind of rhetorical gesture that says in advance, I will have answered the criticism. Or at the same time, and not only because there is this incredible recourse to laughter as a critical tool in a kind of non-dialectical mode, in a non-argumentative mode. But I would say that sense of the difficulty of rendering Bataille's thought in an instrumental mode would be well borne in mind by queer theory as well. I mean, there's a strong tradition of both Nietzschean and Bataillean thought in queer theory for all sorts of reasons, not simply the disavowal of all of those forms of calculative reasoning that undergird and that redouble, heteronormative reproductivity, or that reduce questions of sexual relation to questions of reproductivity. So, I mean, on the one hand, it's completely intelligible to me that it would have that role within the very diverse field of queer studies. Not just Warner, but Judith Butler. So many people have turned to Bataille. I think in the case that you're describing, the literature on barebacking and so forth, it has reached its nadir. I mean, I really think that. I mean, if that's what a Bataillean analysis means, is finding finding the example of the kind of expenditure that risks itself in the form of possible exposure to HIV. If that's what we're getting from Bataille, I'm not prepared to take it on in the form of queer theory that I practice. That's not helpful to me. I think the more profound critical interrogation of the alliance between heteronormative reproductivity and certain forms of economism, analytically but also politically, that strikes me as a kind of mode of thought, a mode of interrogation that would be all to the good. I mean, that is, it lines up too well. It's such a pure projection of it provides such an easy figure of the things we think are signified by expenditure, by risk, but they're basically contained within this Manichaean opposition between what would have been good normative sexuality and what would be dangerous sexuality in the context of safe sex and all that other stuff. I mean, I could pose that question, in the place where I work with migrant laborers who work in absolutely desperately dangerous circumstances, who every single day say they don't know if they will, come out of those mines, and often don't, in which corpses do the work that you describe. But I would be very loath to want to say, okay, these people are willing chance. They are in that kind of position to assume the consciousness that Bataille is describing for us. So I guess this is probably will seem like a skirting or a disavowal of your question of how do we use it. And my answer would be, it's the kind of thing that can't be used, but it is the kind of thing also that would allow one to understand why one needs to think of theorizing as using theory. I will.
I mean, your approach is very interesting. It reminds me of a text that Bataille wrote in the early 30s called The Use Value of Sad. But it is, of course, a text which has a kind of surrealist dimension. And the title is itself so provocative, that you can somehow apply sad in real or daily life. Yeah. So I think it's. But I am sorry. Your question about the structure psychologique du fascisme. It's a text I don't really know what it is about somehow. Yeah. But about the laughter, I was thinking, you know, that kind of launching preparation of Sur Nietzsche by Bataille in early 44 started with a major discussion that Bataille organized with Sartre, discussion on the concept of sin. And so there is a lot of philosophers, theologians who are there, and I guess Bataille thought it would really prepare the literary circle to receive his book. And Sartre had written a very important article on the previous book, L'Expérience intérieure, in which he doubted, he said, you know, I don't know how you say rire jaune in English. It's kind of a fake laughter. Sartre said, I don't believe in Bataille's laughter. Bataille, Monsieur Bataille, rire jaune. And at the end of that discussion, which is very fascinating, Bataille, you know, who has been attacked by all the people who are there, is totally alone and say, well, of course, you know, I was not prepared for that discussion. I was not. And he said, well, I see myself, it's a kind of a reversal of the beginning of the De Naturarium by Lucrèce, where, you know, Lucrèce describes the pleasure of people feeling safe on a cliff and looking at the ship, you know, getting into a shipwreck, you know. But I said, in fact, what my position would be, my dream would be in that ship who is sinking, you know, and I would laugh at the false sense of security that those people on the cliff have. So there is always a claim, excessive, as you say, excessive claim of laughter in Bataille. Who would imagine that someone would be, you know, in such a situation and in fact laugh? But there is always that idea that, which is a kind of Nietzschean idea that, you know, Nietzsche, but I always quote that sentence by Nietzsche, to see the noble figure sing and laugh, and to laugh at tragedy. You know, Bataille refuses the Aristotelian opposition between comedy and tragedy. And tragedy is, in fact, something that should be laughable, not at all in a superficial way, but in kind of deep way.
Yeah, so, you know, it's interesting, you were mentioning the text on Sade, which to a certain extent reads a bit as Réparation à Sade, right? And so there was this Réparation à Nietzsche, and then he also felt the need to do a Réparation à Sade. And I wonder if one day we should do a Réparation à Bataille, right, in this context. Because when you look at some of these passages, it's just, it's done. Okay, right, it's done. So, but just certain of these passages, when you look at the text, I mean, there's certain things about it that really require, it seems, reparation from what has often been done with Bataille. So in the preface, right, when he says, ma tension, my animating tension, he says, right, this mad desire to laugh, it's little different, diffère peu, of the passions that burn in the heroes of Sade, he says. And he adds, and yet it is also so close to those of martyrs and of saints, right? So, I mean, you know, that might require some reparation. Exactly, right. Or when on page 16 of the preface, when he says, and this was a passage that Rosalind was quoting, but you know, I am opposed to all forms of coercion. And then he writes, je n'en fais pas moins pour autant du mal l'objet d'une recherche morale extrême, which I think was confusingly translated in the English. But it's basically saying, you know, despite that, it's not as if I'm making of evil an object of an extreme moral research, right? So it has been done, but maybe it needs to be redone.
So I apologize if this is somewhat out of left field, but I find myself thinking, I think, along similar lines to Linda and prioritizing, at least based on the fragments that were posted in advance, a sort of a question about what's happening with the diagnosis of fascism and its relationship to democracy. And to a certain degree, it's a question to ask about the presence of the language of sovereignty. Either its absence or its presence, its movement from Nietzsche's sovereign subject or a kind of sovereign behavior to the kind of sovereignty that's being performed in gift giving. So I have the voice in the back of my head is Hegel in the Philosophy of Right, trying to show us how all gifts basically can be reduced to forms of market exchange, except for one kind, the gifts, the so-called gift in the proper sense, which is no explanation for in the Philosophy of Right. This is like the one line, the proper gift isn't reducible to a form of exchange or a contract. But there's no real explanation of what that gift is, other than the kind of gift which can never really be repaid and is sort of this gesture of sovereignty. So my question, though, is where is sovereignty, this is just please to help me, in or how we understand Bataille's reading of Nietzsche in relation to a reparation around the question of National Socialism, of fascism, and of trying to chart some kind of not program, not use of theory towards something, but a way of understanding what has happened. The other fragment in my head is, and this might seem particularly out of place, but architectures of confinement are there, is George Jackson saying in 1971 that if you want a definition of fascism, the word is reform, specifically economic reform. The accountability and making accountable is exactly the expression of fascism that Jackson experiences incarcerated in the United States. If accounting on the one hand is the expression of fascist sovereignty under architectures of confinement, what is it in 1944 as planes come overhead in a kind of vague liberation, if that makes any sort of sense? And so it's a question about how sovereignty does or doesn't show up here with all the other terms that are sort of moving.
I guess after rereading Denis and rereading Bataille, and thinking about the years since the 1960s and 1970s, I'm inclined to call for reparation à l'architecture, in the sense that, yes, the architect, let's say architecton as sovereign, right? It's in Plato's statesman, right? The statesman is compared to and has both the theoretical knowledge and the knowledge of management, but not the craft to actually do it, right? So this is where the architect stands. And it pertains, I think, to the use of theory, or to the use of philosophy, right? And if you think of the way in which architects have continuously, well, let's say, the way in which philosophers have continuously used images or models or structures of architecture in order to define the structure of their thought, or the non-structure of their thought, from Plato on through Descartes, through Kant. On the other hand, how architects are very, very casually picked up on what they think philosophy is saying, right? I mean, there are architects who felt in the early 20th century that Nietzsche was the absolute paragon and authoritative voice for transparency, for unlimited space, for l'espace infini. And there were other architects who felt that Bataille, for example, was the key to developing the fragmented image of the monument in ruins, the kind of what later was called by not too helpful architecture critics postmodernism, right? So that, to me, is the kind of use of I do a book called The Architectural Uncanny. Students ask me how they can design it, right? That kind of stuff, right? So I think there is a sense that we have to be able to read, and this is why I don't teach architectural theory, but thinking about architecture, because to draw is to think, right? And to think is to draw. And so in a certain kind of sense, reading Bataille actually brings me up short with the limitations of a literal application, because he always, in a sense, redefines himself out of being literally applied, right? Which is what excites me, and what I think excited someone like Bernard Tschumi, for example, when he wants to, in some way or another, undermine the verities of Corbusian modernism, and at the same time introduce play, games, movement, action, and various kinds of chance into the relationship between the subject and the object in architecture, right? So this is where it comes, but it comes not literally, right, as a labyrinth, right? Whereas at the same time, you've got architects who did, deep, sort of dark caverns of Holocaust-like structures that literally followed Bataille's, I think, rather flip remark. But if you have the Parthenon, the pyramid, and the Holocaust are all in the same way the catastrophes of mankind. So okay, we can begin to build, the tombs of mankind in architecture. And so I think there's a point where a good reading of Bataille resists that. And I think Rosalind pointed that out.
I mean, your question is an interesting one. People who know more than me will tell me I'm wrong, so they can do so in a second. I think the interesting thing about Sur Nietzsche is the way in which it, in some profound way, displaces the question of sovereignty with the relationship between immanence and transcendence on one hand, and on the other hand, displaces sovereignty with the question of communication on the other. And it's the communication here is, it's emptying oneself out into another. I mean, it's both sexual and not, and more than sexual in that way. But I'm conscious that at this moment in time, in the places where I hang out, as opposed to philosophy or political science, certain kind of human sciences, feminist queer theory, and so forth, that Bataille stands in for the philosopher of sovereignty and the philosopher of freedom, and that in a kind of popular intellectual sphere, that those are the values that attach to that intellectual project. And it's interesting to me that freedom and sovereignty would be linked. Actually, I'm one of those people who think sovereignty is not a helpful ideal, never mind concept, for a couple of reasons. But I think it's interesting to ask ourselves, after, say, 50 years of different cultural experiments in freedom, explorations in freedoms, whether it's tripping or fucking or music or whatever, all of these forms of experimentation in freedom, as well as experiments in political form, other than party forms and so forth, that we are nonetheless at a moment in which all of the forms against which those explorations in freedom organize themselves are resurgent, indeed assuming ascendant, in some cases more dominant. And that what we turn to are the concepts sovereignty, especially, and sovereignty in, or freedom in sovereignty, as the answer to that complex dialectical or resurgent form against which these other exploratory practices and movements arrayed themselves. And I just have a question about whether that is the term that ought to organize the forms of exploring freedom now, and how it is that we want to, and maybe because that an adoration of exactly that concept was the mechanism by which many more radical emancipatory projects were themselves internally negated. And I'm talking for everything from decolonizing state projects to emancipatory sexual communities that, or that at least construed sovereignty in those economistic terms as right to choose from within certain kinds of structures. So for me, that's the question is that the term through which to undertake an interrogation of these, let's say at best partially, but certainly partially successful explorations?
Yes, I think the question, the question of sovereignty, the question of the intransitivity of sovereignty is a very important one, and I am sure that there is only one reading of it. But I was thinking that, what there is, I think, a word which hasn't been uttered today, which is at the center of Bataille's thought and also of the readings, negative or positive, of Bataille, which is a concept of transgression, which is, I was thinking when I briefly talked about Deleuze, and there is that, I would say, a whole, post-68 way of approaching those issues. What they always rejected in Bataille was the idea of expanse as transgression, and so the idea that there is a dialectic that ties desire to a taboo, that the idea that essentially there is no desire which is not created by a kind of law that says no, and yeah, I don't know exactly how it would articulate with the question of sovereignty, but I think that's one of the, I think, deep questions that the text of Bataille raises, is that is sexuality inherently transgressive, and what does that mean? Where the taboo is, socially, psychologically, and all. I think that's one of the most important theme of Bataille's reception. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you.